Screen share.
Do we want this or you want this?
Presentation.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So it's gonna also have this.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Annual Joan Coffey Memorial Lecture. This lecture honors the life and legacy of Dr. Joan Coffey, who taught French and world history at Sam Houston State University until her death in 2003. Dr. Coffey began her career teaching in public and private secondary schools in Chicago and Milwaukee. She returned to graduate school and earned her MA and PhD in history from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Upon receiving her doctorate, she joined our departmental faculty in 1990. During her 13 years on the faculty, Dr. Coffey placed articles in reviews in church history, French historical studies, and the Catholic Historical Review. The University of Notre Dame Press published her book, Léon Armel, Entrepreneur as Catholic Social Reformer, just weeks after her death. Joan left behind her husband of 37 years, Ed, who continues to be a dear friend and generous benefactor of this department and our students. We are thrilled to once again be hosting this event in person and are fortunate to have an exceptional historian of the early modern Mediterranean world on hand to deliver this year's lecture. To introduce our guest speaker, I want to call upon our own talented Ottomanist, my friend and colleague, Dr. Pinar Emiralioglu.
It is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce you Dr. Nükhet Varlık. Dr. Nükhet Varlık is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, New York. She is a historian of the Ottoman Empire, interested in disease, death, medicine, and public health. Her first book, Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, The Ottoman Experience, 1347 to 1600, which was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2015, is the first systematic scholarly study of the Ottoman experience of plague during the Black Death pandemic and the centuries that followed. Plague and Empire received the Middle East Studies Association's 2016 Albert Hourani Book Award, the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association's 2016 Fuat Köprülü Book Prize, the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean's 2017 Dennis Agius Prize, and the American Association for the History of Medicine's 2018 George Rosen Prize. Her published edited volume, Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean from 2017, is a collection of articles on the social, cultural, and political responses to epidemics in the post-Black Death Islamic Mediterranean. Dr. Varlık is also the co-editor of Death and Disease in the Medieval and Early Modern World, Perspectives from Across the Mediterranean and Beyond, forthcoming this year from York Medieval Press. Her new book project, Empire, Ecology, and Plague, Rethinking the Second Pandemic, 1340s to 1940s, examines the 600-year-old Ottoman plague experience in a global ecological context. In conjunction with this research, Dr. Warlick gathers sources pertaining to the history of plague, contributes to the development of the Black Death Digital Archive. She is also involved in multidisciplinary research projects that incorporate perspectives from molecular genetics, ancient DNA research in particular, bioarchaeology, disease ecology, and climate science in historical inquiry. Today, Dr. Warlick will talk us about the legacy of the Black Death and how we can rethink the past plagues in an age of pandemics. Without further ado, I would welcome Dr. Nuket to SAM. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pinar, for this generous introduction. My dear colleague and friend, Pinar Emirolioğlu. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be delivering the annual Joan Coffey Memorial Lecture. And thank you all for being here. And I hope I will not depress you even more talking about the pandemic. I know we've all had enough with it. So talking about the legacy of past pandemics will be what we will be doing today together. And hopefully I will be presenting to you some of the historical dimensions by which we learned to think about pandemics, our historical imagination of past pandemics, but I think some of this research and some of these discussions will resonate with some of our present day concerns. So I'll try to make it as palatable as possible for those of us who are still kind of tired of being in a pandemic state of mind. Okay, so this is where I would like to start. And if I walk in the room, do you think my voice is carrying? I just want to make sure because I don't have the mic. Okay, so this is where I would like to start. And again, just thinking of this as a way of thinking together about the history of pandemics. And here, of course, we've seen lots of different caricatures and political cartoons since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, making references to older historical pandemics, right? And I think this is kind of clear to all of us in this room. COVID-19 and the shape of the SARS-CoV virus. So those are, and the mask, those are all elements that are recognizable to us. But there's a little more here that perhaps we might want to think about, and basically thinking about what they stand for, what are the role of these historical elements. And here, I think it's clear to us, and I would assume that it is, that there are some references to the Black Death, right? Some medieval, excuse me, some medieval themes, excuse me, some medieval cultural elements being evoked here, especially the motif of the black cloak, the skeleton, right? So, and we can also take a look at how older pandemics are represented in political culture. But I think, of course, we've seen many of these, stories and cartoons and caricatures about Spanish flu came up a lot during, at least in the early weeks and months of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Black Death seems to be the mother of all pandemics, right? This is not only in political culture, but also in academic discussions. This is also something that we see a lot, the Black Death being discussed as a general framework by which to study and understand past pandemics, even by historians of the medieval period. And yet, even though recent discussions of Ebola, Spanish flu, and all those other pandemics come up, Black Death has seems to have a special place in the history of pandemics. And so, why is the Black Death important, and how does it determine the way we think about current day pandemics? And in fact, how does it serve that role of being the mother of all pandemics? And I would argue that since the 19th century, in fact, perhaps even more specifically, starting in 1830, we see the development of historical epidemiology, starting with Western Europe, and then a tradition that gradually developed over the course of the 19th century and even into the 20th and 21st century, having creating an important intellectual lineage of thinking, or setting the patterns of the kind of general themes of thinking of past pandemics. So in this new age of pandemics, I am trying to see if it's possible to rethink the legacy of past pandemics that we have inherited from 19th century historical epidemiology and questioning some of the basic tenets of this line of thinking. And here I'm specifically referring to basically two main historical assumptions. And I believe that this will resonate with us today because I believe that we're still suffering from some of the consequences of this way of thinking, especially in terms of policy development in the area of public health. And one of these is to think of pandemics as short-term cataclysmic events that we think about as belonging to here and now. We want to conceptualize or want to think of pandemics as either current day phenomena or as historical phenomena that we can understand as something that is kind of limited in time, but catastrophic, right? So this discussion of past pandemics as short-term cataclysmic events, I think is something that is preventing us to historicize them to their fullest extent, because I think we would be better served if we think of pandemics as long-term processes. So the first intervention that I'm trying to make here is moving beyond that way of thinking about the pandemics as short-term events and just adopting a long-term point of view of thinking of them as processes. And just very quickly, I mean, as much as this is relevant for historical pandemics, this is also relevant to our current day pandemic. We hear a lot of discussions that, you know, we're now like feeling like we're moving on and leaving the pandemic behind. And even though it's now very controversial with the whole discussion around masks, that's still the product of thinking of pandemics as short-term. And in fact, if we look at public health regulations in this country or globally, you would see that most of them focus on dealing with pandemics as a crisis, much in the same way that we would deal with other forms of natural disasters, right? With like earthquakes, tsunamis, these kinds of natural disasters. But, you know, I think there's another layer of thinking in this that we should question, is that, you know, we basically accept the fact that these are beyond our control, right? Like almost like supernatural or natural phenomena that is like that things that we cannot control, right? Whereas in the case of pandemics, that is something that we know from scientific studies, you know, pandemics are preventable. If you invest in the right area of research, if you do your research well, if you look at newly emerging and re-emerging diseases in different parts of the world, you know target areas and you can do the kind of research before pandemics become cataclysmic phenomena that they are. So that's one area of research where I think, you know, again, most of the time, mostly in the context of historical pandemics, shifting our point of view of thinking about pandemics from short-term events to long-term processes will add a lot in our understanding of this research. And one simple example here would be the case of the Black Death, right? Black Death, and I'm sure, you know, most of you are familiar, maybe in your courses, you know, studying the Black Death, right? And as something that is usually taught as belonging to the mid-14th century European society, whereas that kind of, you know, being the product of that line of thinking of a pandemic, kind of the short-term definition of it, is a very limited view of the Black Death itself. In fact, new research suggests that the Black Death for the early origins of the second go back at least 1 century before that. So now this new research is arguing that the Black Death started in the 13th century, not the 14th century. And it continued until at least the 19th century. So we're talking about a 500 or 600 or 700-year historical development. We see the occurrence and reoccurrence of plague outbreaks throughout Afro-Eurasia. We're talking about something that affected human society for a very long time, repeated, and a very large geographic area. And yet we still want to think of the Black Death, or we continue to teach the Black Death as if something that is real limited to a few years in human history. We're wrong. We need to rethink our way of talking about and teaching the Black Death. Another example, or another kind of criticism that I'm trying to develop with respect to historical outbreaks and pandemics is that you will have a very limited point of view if you study history of pandemics only with respect to one location. And of course, regional studies and local studies, urban histories, they are all incredibly helpful in enriching our point of view in the study of disease. But unless you have a trans-regional perspective, global, or even like semi-global hemispheric study of multi-regional study of pandemics, you will have a very limited understanding of what is going on. So for that reason, I would argue that it is important to have a wider geographic perspective, trying to incorporate the disease experiences of different regions and thinking about pandemics as like large-scale phenomena. But that short-term cataclysmic event perspective, that is something that has its own history. What I just mentioned a few minutes ago, starting the historical epidemiology, starting in Western Europe in 1830s, and interestingly enough, that research is triggered by pandemics of cholera. The writing of history about the Black Death, as we know and understand today, starts in 1830s in Germany, and then later on in England, we have mostly medical writers, medical doctors, writing about the history of disease. They're not trained as historians. They are medical doctors, trained in what they call then as pathology, like disease studies, and just taking an interest in history. But then they bring their own vision of historical imagination. And in these writings, and there's particularly one medical story that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So just bringing this point of, or this way of thinking about the Black Death as something almost supernatural, or mysterious, and kind of having the bizarre themes, and having an apocalyptic taste. So all these are important flavors on this narrative that starts in the 19th century. Interestingly enough, this line of thinking about the Black Death kind of bleeds into to the study of later pandemics. And another thing that I would, I should probably point out here is that there's a very, very heavy Orientalist and Eurocentric and Orientalist tone to be right? So you see the discussion of disease mostly in the context of European societies, and the disease experiences of other societies outside of Europe are really erased from this history, or something that would appear in the background, right? And the discussion about the disease experience of other societies would only come up into the picture so much as they affect European society. And most of the time, this discussion would be about stigmatizing non-European societies historically when it comes to their historical experiences. So for that reason, I would argue that the legacy of this line of historical writing about past pandemics, in particular the Black Death, but also kind of, as something that affected the historical writing of other pandemics, just created a historical legacy behind it. And in a way, we are still in that legacy of thinking about perhaps it would be helpful to remember even the attitude of global media in the early days of the pandemic. Pandemics, COVID-19 pandemic only became newsworthy when it arrived in Europe and North America, right? And, again, interestingly enough, we don't see much coverage of the pandemic experiences of other parts of the world. And some of this are either omitted or not really worthy of being reported. I mean, clearly just, giving the message of the lives of certain individuals, are more newsworthy than the lives of others. I mean, this is not only the present day values, we see the same thing in historical texts. When you see, when there's a pandemic, either we're talking about the Black Death or other recurrent outbreaks of the Black Death or cholera and whatnot, there are infinitely more texts and studies and books and articles written on the European experience of disease as opposed to the experience of non-European society, right? So there is an incredible imbalance between, what the scholarship sees as worthy of being studied and what is not. So for that reason, I would argue that pandemic narratives matters, right? We need to think about how we tell these stories and why it is something that is still affecting not only historical debates and questions, but not only history writing, but even our scientific studies are affected by some of these assumptions, right? I think the most basic easy examples would be to think about, for example, when you look at studies in paleopathology and paleogenomics, where today we have the studies of ancient DNA, you can retrieve ancient pathogens from human remains. And in the case of plague, most famously, you can retrieve asbestos bacterium, the bacterium that causes plague. You can retrieve ancient DNA of this bacterium from human remains, especially from bones and teeth, right? And when you look at these studies, where do you find these samples are retrieved from or gathered from? Europe. All we know, almost all of the extant right now, circulating ancient DNA genomes of Yersinia pestis today, they're almost entirely from Europe. We know for a fact that it affected millions of people in human history for centuries, but all we have still from Europe. So in that sense, and we can go into more details about how this vision of past pandemic is still something that affects scientific studies, I'd be happy to go into that later on. Let me tell you a little bit about why this Black Death, even the name of this pandemic is something that is part of that larger package of thinking about this pandemic legacy, plague legacy, if you will. Even the name of the pandemic, the Black Death, is something that is a product of that historical moment in 19th century European history. When you look at it, and it's I guess, a myth or a wrong piece of information that is circulating still today, many people would believe, or can even find it on Wikipedia, it's everywhere. I see it a lot in student papers. Very frustrated that people believe that Black Death was named Black Death, the pandemic, because it caused like black spots on the human body. that is like, it's a myth, it's wrong. In fact, many parts of the narrative about the history of Black Death is kind of wrong and has been refuted by professional historians, but you still hear them in, popular media and even sometimes in textbooks. So, but the name Black Death itself, of course, does not refer to the disease causing black spots, because that way of thinking, that reflects our modern understanding of disease, right? Medieval people, the contemporaries of the Black Death, did not define the pandemic in that way. They usually refer to it as the great mortality, sometimes the great death, right? Usually talking about it as the great mortality is as a term that we see in many European languages, but not as the Black Death. But the Black Death itself has its own lineage, starting with, starting with Hecker, this German medical historian that I was referring to earlier. He was the first to coin this term. In fact, in German, there's what's it called, right? He wrote this book in 1832, and then it was translated into English as the Black Death. In fact, when you look at the origin of the term itself and how it entered the English language, again, originally in German, later on finds its way in the English language, and only from then on, it becomes popular. In fact, it's not even like a mainstream established term until the turn of the 20th century, until the third pandemic, what is called the third pandemic, starts. The outbreak of plague that starts in Hong Kong, British Hong Kong in 1894, and then spreads globally. In fact, that is during the third pandemic that plague, well, I'm saying in this context, comes to the west coast of the US, right? Plague of San Francisco, probably familiar to some of you in this room at least. So, but this naming practice, even just thinking about the name of the Black Death as something that belongs to European history, is something that we see beginning with Hecker, but again, it has a very complicated and toxic legacy. And to be able to unpack some of that cultural baggage that comes to the front of historical epidemiology with Hecker and with other medical historians after that, we need to look at the ways they discuss pandemics. Again, just as I'm repeating, but I think this is important to remember, these works in the 19th century were not written by professional historians. They're written by medical doctors, right? But they incorporate the ways of thinking about non-European societies into their writing. And here, my own research comes into play because I see how Eastern Oriental societies are depicted and portrayed in these works, how early modern authors talked about the disease experience of non-Western societies, especially, in particular, the closest neighbors of Europe, right? Mainly the Muslim Middle East. But interestingly enough, we see the use of this term Oriental, right? Which is a very vague term to define. It could be referring to Constantinople in the 15th or 16th century, or if you're talking about the plague of Hong Kong at the end of the 19th century, you could still be justifiably talking about Oriental plague, which is something that we see as a medical term. Of course, it doesn't mean anything, but as a cultural term, it had a lot of resonance for the European readers, and it's a term that continued for many centuries. So Oriental plague becomes a way of thinking about not only the disease and the disease experience, but also the social response to plague and other epidemic diseases. So in particular, during the early modern period and all the way into the modern period, you have these European observers, medical doctors, botanists, zoologists, and sometimes diplomats and merchants living, or sometimes doing business in the Middle East, in the Muslim Middle East. And they had a certain set of ways of talking about diseases in these societies, especially among the Muslims. And the classic trope is that Muslims did not understand anything about the natural world. They lacked understanding, even basic understanding of science, and that they lacked the understanding, a basic understanding of contagion. That is to say that the disease could be transmitted from one person to another. Of course, ironically, plague is not a contagious disease. It is not transmitted from one person to another. It's a vector-borne disease. In any case, so you see a lot of kind of the repetition of the same kind of tropes talking about Oriental societies, and the lack of science, according to these authors, is something that they thought that they could explain by the religion of these people, right? Oriental people. They don't understand science because they only understand the world and the cosmos through their religious belief, and their faith is against science. And again, I'm just kind of, simplifying and in a way, perhaps caricaturizing the writings of these observers about Oriental societies, but it became commonplace to talk about in the writings of early modern European observers to talk about the disease experience of Oriental societies. They're using the term that they're using as being passive, not taking any precautions about disease, right? And because they were fatalistic, because they believed that human state, there's no free will, and the future is predestined. If God wants you to die, you will die. So you don't have to take any precaution against disease, right? That's the classic argument that you find in these works, repeated over and over again across multiple centuries. Interestingly enough, you might think that, oh, it's something that later scholars did not take seriously. That is the opposite, quite the opposite. And in fact, even in the 1970s or up to the end of the 20th century, when you look at any respectable work by a historian, world historian, just, even open like John McNeill's, Willie McNeill's Plagues and Peoples, like written in the 1970s, that's a classic stereotype still continues, that Muslim societies were passive in the face of disease. They did not take any precautions. It was Europeans that developed the anti-disease legislation, anti-disease measures. And the classic argument is centered around the adoption of quarantine measures and isolation practices, and building of more sanitary cities, and the development of better urban sanitation structures, right? So that's an argument that we see being repeated until very recently. And I mean, of course, I don't have the time to go into all the details of like deconstructing what is wrong with that argument. And I published quite a bit on that question. And yet perhaps I should say here that those narratives have their own histories as well. Most importantly, I would argue that the Plague of Marseille is an important turning point in that history, because even though throughout the early modern period, we see the circulation of these myths of associating the Oriental people with themes of disease, with backwardness, with lacking an understanding of contagion or basic sanitation methods, it's only after the Plague of Marseille in 1720 to 1722 that we see that these views, these historical notions become mainstream, right? We see them not as just circulating myths in travelers' accounts, but really in the scientific literature of its time. Just one example would be to talk about the French Enlightenment, for example, how some of these older myths were incorporated in mainstream scientific writing of its time. When you look at the entry on plague in the great encyclopedia of the Enlightenment, you find very interesting statements in as a scientific writing of its time. Here, like very clearly, all the plagues that have appeared in Europe in the last 2,000 years have been transmitted through the communication of the Saracens, a derogatory term used for Muslims, Arabs, Moors, or Turks with us. And none of our plagues had any other source. Perhaps I should have underlined this, right? Interestingly enough, this line of thinking still continues. My own research basically, well, let me just say a few things about this image and then I'll go on to just commenting about why that is wrong. I mean, perhaps, okay, let me just go back for 1 second. Just very quickly here, what is wrong with the statement? First of all, I mean, I think it speaks for itself, but if we want to point out some factual errors in it, it's talking about how all the plagues in Europe have been transmitted for 2,000 years from Arabs and Muslims, but you don't even have you don't even have Islam at that point for for 2,000 years. And even, the statement that no other plague had been introduced to Europe from any other source. And it just goes on. And I just wanted to highlight a very brief passage here. And here I think this would be, I thought this would be a good image to talk about the visual articulation of what, the previous scientific statement said about the disease experience of Oriental societies. Here, I think we're looking at something that is clearly articulated visually, because of course this is a depiction that Napoleon commissioned. It's a painting by this French painter Antoine Jangot in the year 1804. Of course, this is depicting a scene in which Napoleon is visiting the plague victims in Jaffa, but in reality, this never happened. This is like pure propaganda in which, of course, Napoleon appears to be visiting or even just, healing the plague victims by his royal touch, making references to older French history. But I think it's very clear. I mean, of course, the Oriental setting in the background, right? Clearly recognizable themes of Oriental architecture. But at the same time, Napoleon and his soldiers, being represented with their uniforms and the disciplined bodies of the European men, as opposed to the sickly, almost inhuman representation of Oriental bodies, right? And the contrast between them, the contrast between these bodies is something that is clearly seen as also the appearance of an Oriental healer, right? All of these are very pronounced, visually articulated in this image. And of course, it's not a surprise because in the 19th century, I mean, I just very quickly going back to, this is from 1765, as I said, Plague of Marseille is kind of when it becomes mainstream. And almost 50 years after the Plague of Marseille, we see this encyclopedia discussion of plague along these lines. Moving forward a little time, this is early 19th century. And of course, I'm just trying to highlight the process here just with a few prominent examples. But in the 19th century and into the early 20th, politically speaking, the Oriental, here represented perhaps by the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, is the sick man of Europe already, right? So it's very convenient to talk about the disease experience of Muslim societies along these lines because they're no longer a military or political threat to Europe, right? So the Oriental sickly bodies of the early modern period, that was something that was spoken about more metaphorically in that sense. Now, in realistic political and military terms, the society is the sick man of Europe, right? So perhaps more fitting into those discussions to adopt this line of thinking and to apply it to the military and political context for the future of the empire. The Ottoman Empire is the sick man of Europe at this time. Interestingly enough, this metaphor of the sick man of Europe is later on adopted to Asia, East Asian societies, right? And China being referred to as the sick man of Asia is something that we see. And, interestingly enough, those discussions also coincide with the third plague pandemic starting in the British Hong Kong, as I just mentioned, 1894 at Hungary. So this Orient, kind of very term to pin down, with respect to time and space in the writings of these first travelers and scientists, but then later on finding its way into modern historiography and modern scientific scholarship, this Oriental plague, Oriental disease, Oriental sickly societies, right? Lacking an understanding of science, backwards, and when you look at the origin of the development of these myths, and partly related to the fact that the European observers going to these Middle Eastern and Muslim cities and not being able to really understand what was going on around them, and perhaps sometimes relying on some observers, multilingual individuals, diplomats and other officials helping them with translation, but really not being able to understand the scientific, high register scientific discussions around those things. That I should also add that plague and writings about plague was a very prolific area of research, historically speaking, but also with respect to ideas about medicine, about public health. And we see a very continuous, long chain, succession of writings of scholars writing about the plague in the Islamic world. In fact, even the genre of plague treatises starts in the Islamic world with the first pandemic and then continuing into the second pandemic. Here, just to clarify terms, perhaps you may have heard of the Justinianic plague that started in the middle of 6th century and continued until the middle of 8th century. That's the first historically recorded pandemic of plague in the Mediterranean world, during which you see the medical discussions being written down, both in the Islamic world and Europe. Interestingly enough, those discussions mainly making references to the symptoms of disease, talking about plague as the bubonic plague, as we know, the location of buboes in the body, references to fever or other physical symptoms of the disease, also making references to how plague spreads, talking about natural and supernatural explanations of disease. In addition to this, you find the recipes, medical discussions about how to treat plague, even though of course no one was really able to treat plague. I mean, only after after 1950s, when we have antibiotics, the bacterial infection, no one in the world knew how to treat this disease. But you have centuries of scholarly writing about this disease. Even the genre of plague treatises is something that starts with this disease. In fact, plague is the first disease to get its own genre of writing, right? And in multiple languages, and you see Arabic, Persian, Ottoman Turkish. Similarly, you see these writings in Latin, later on in French, Italian, German, English. So we have this body of scholarship being produced over and over again, like new works being written, new others are being translated, edited. So a very lively area of scholarship that continued for centuries, both in the Islamic world in Europe, across many centuries. And yet you see these depictions and these recurrent tropes of talking about the disease experience of Oriental societies in a very limited and limiting fashion, still kind of in our period. Let me just check how we're doing with time, because I can continue a little more. So just perhaps I'll finish with this. And I was saying earlier how this not only something that affects our own day, modern day pandemic, our way of thinking about pandemics, how historians think about it. Well, let's just take a look at how scientists, still continue to repeat these structures of thinking about history of pandemics. This, in fact, comes from a science article published in 2020, very recently, in the Proceedings of National Academy of Science, one of the most prestigious science journals of a study on paleogenetics. Here, the authors find it perfectly fine to make an argument and to show with these big arrows that, it's very clear to me looking at this map that plague, it kind of spreads from Anatolia or the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe, right? This red arrow here, the big one, is kind of like saying the plague of Marseille comes from the Eastern Mediterranean. This has no historical basis whatsoever. There is actually no outbreak of plague. I mean, I have been collecting historical documents about the history of plague in the Middle East for the last 20 years. In fact, I am the director of a new digital project called the Black Death Digital Archive. We've been collecting thousands of entries on the presence of plague from different languages, and we construct a digital website. There is no recorded outbreak of plague in the Eastern Mediterranean immediately preceding the plague of Marseille in 1720. And yet, every textbook, every piece of scholarship will tell you that it came from the East. It has no basis. But it's okay to publish this research in scientific journals, right? I mean, that's perhaps why historians should interfere in these arguments. I mean, we often make a case of how history is important to understand our world in today's world and, policy, yes, but perhaps even science, has some things to learn from historians, right? I mean, it's kind of, perhaps a responsibility as a historian to intervene in these debates. Similarly, here, let's look at this arrow. If you're wondering about, in this research, they found a few ancient DNA evidence in a cemetery, Pestbacken Cemetery in Sweden, dating from early 18th century. Where would it be from? Oh, of course it's from Istanbul, even though you don't have any evidence about anything that happens in this area. So it must be from here. Like you can put your arrow in the way you want to talk about that history, right? So it just, by trying to, well, I mean, perhaps part of it is related to the fact that there is not enough research on what is going on in this area. But when historians don't talk about this area, then perhaps it's kind of open for anyone to make any argument they want to make. But as a scholar who's done, at least for the last 20 years, work on studying the disease experience of this region, that is not what I see. And that does not seem to support the arguments that either historians or scientists want to make to depict the Middle East or the larger Oriental region as the source of all pandemics that arrived in Europe, right? I think I will conclude here, but we can go into other details if we have questions. Thank you. Should I take questions? All right. Yeah.
The impact of these places.
Thank you for that question, because I mean, this is what you see, that it's how other people speak on their behalf to represent them in a certain way. But when you look at the sources, in fact, you find very interesting discussions that don't seem to support them. Well, this is a very big question, but I can try to give some highlights because we're talking about a body of works that continued for centuries, right? So I'd be summarizing in a few sentences what people wrote across like 5 and 6 centuries, right? So there's a lot of different opinions and things change. The way people think about disease, the way people think about plague change over time. But perhaps if we want to kind of make a very brief summary, I would say that in the first centuries of the Black Death pandemic in Western Asia, you find descriptions of disease, especially in the context of the Muslim world, that plague is described as an apocalyptic phenomenon, most of the time as something that is within the definition of religious understanding and a divine will, perhaps sometimes as a punishment of people, though you find those kinds of descriptions in like the Christian tradition as well, as kind of a general kind of religious understanding of plague. But over time, you see those themes fading, especially sometime around the 16th century. You see disease or plague especially something that is described as something that could be understood as part of the natural world. And gradually it comes to be seen as an urban phenomenon because cities, are people like population density and people, closer to one another. And so they come to see it as an urban phenomenon. And over time, they come to associate it with poverty. So those are things that kind of generally speaking, I think we want to think about the big transitions. And so the religious elements in that discussion kind of, they don't disappear, but like they seem to fade into the background. But it's also important to pay attention to who's writing, right? When you look at the writings of religious scholars, you find other discussions about plague. When you look at the writings of medical doctors, for example, you see other discussions. For example, they say you need to flee wherever there is plague. The safest thing you can do, just leave plague-infested cities, right? And they use a number of methods for treatment or prevention, right? Perhaps some of those worked. We just need to understand them better. For example, even though they did not know that fleas were carrying disease, the bacteria from rodents or rats to human, they used some methods to some aromatic oils as to protect themselves from plague. But perhaps those worked as flea repellent, because I saw lots of medical recipes in which doctors will make notes on the margins in those medical manuscripts that saying like, I use this method with my patient and this method works, right? You see all these kind of like a development of an experimental knowledge about disease because these were physicians who were, on a day-to-day basis dealing with disease and plague cases, right? And the clinical descriptions of plague, even like the earliest ones that I have in my sources from the Ottoman period, coming from like the early 15th century, like very accurate. I mean, they know what they're talking about. So it would be completely compatible, 100% compatible with our modern biological understanding of what plague is and how it manifests in the body and the prognosis of the disease and interventions. I mean, they try to, in some cases, like intervene on the plague vivos, draining them. In others, we see methods of cauterization. There are very interesting experimental methods of using a live chicken or live pigeon, placing those birds on the plague vivos, usually armpits or the groin area and then behind the neck, behind the ears and neck. So those like live birds, if the bird died, it means that the patient would recover. If was the other way, it was usually taken as an omen that the patient would. So Yeah, you have a number of methods. One of them was using yeah, a clay earth called terra sigillata in the sources from an island on the Aegean. Was extracted only once a year with some ceremonies, and those made they were like, you know, that clay tablets were dried in sun. And you know, every single account that I read, like they swear by this, just you know, curing plague. We have yet to test it in the lab whether it works or not, right? But according to our modern day biological knowledge, you know, before the 19th century, before the use of antibiotics, we don't know if they were. But what we know is that they tried, right? In fact, when you look at the discussions contained by the authors writing in the Islamic world, and you compare them to those like the contemporaries writing in Europe, there's really nothing that differentiates their discussion because they're talking about the same disease. Like until the 19th century, we were being very similar to one another. So perhaps that's kind of a general answer to your question, but if you have a follow-up, I'm happy to address it. No, okay, thanks. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Happy to talk about. Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, I should have. Remember how I was talking about plague myths, and that's one of them. In fact, completely refuted by professional historians. And I would actually recommend the writing. I mean, a recent article by a brilliant medieval historian, Hannah Barker, who wrote about this. So basically, it's false about this whole story of, you know, using the plague bodies and catapulting over the, and that story, you know, I mean, people had some doubts about it because you just cannot transmit plague in that way, biologically speaking. But the historian who worked on this question, Hannah Barker, actually, interestingly enough, that entire story comes from one single source. There's only one source that talks about it, a contemporary account. And this Gabriele de Musi, I think, if I'm not mistaken, writing about it in Italy, and he was a notary public in Italy, working at that time, but wrote that as if he was an eyewitness, right? So this historian actually went and, you know, worked in the archives, and so she found out that when he claimed to be an eyewitness to the plague outbreak around that time, he was actually in his office in Italy. So he actually never went. But I mean, it's one powerful example to remember how these myths can continue. Perhaps they serve a purpose that either it has a certain kind of appeal in political culture or our historical imagination. Even though they're completely wrong, we still hear them. They're being repeated. I mean, perhaps, you know, and it really irritates me when I see this in my students' paper, that, you know, COVID-19 was started with bat soup, right? I mean, I don't know if like generations later, we're gonna read it somewhere else, which is pulling my hair. So how myths can continue even though they're proven wrong by science, right? How does this happen? But it's a good question to ask. We need to rewrite the textbooks, right? Thank you for bringing that. I think that's important, right? Because we continue teaching the wrong information. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to throw out given your research, how would you find work, especially because to gather certainly the spatial dimension, really big scale, global scale, or also got what you're saying very long term
In fact, I will also add or problematize the term endemic into your question because just it's relevant. I think that's a brilliant question because even the term pandemic or the terminology that we're using has its own history, and it really helps at the specific historical context that defines those terms, right? So interestingly enough, I looked into the origin of the use of this term pandemic, both in scientific literature and historical literature. It was not a common term until the turn of the 20th century. So I was actually hoping to find that the historical epidemiologists in the late 19th century would have used that term. You find it in a few, in fact, I mean, I published on this and I'm happy to share you the publication, send the publication. So I was like looking to find the term pandemic, right? In a few examples, I think you find maybe even around the year 1900, whenever they use the term pandemic, they define in parentheses what it means, a global epidemic or like a large scale epidemic, which suggests that the term itself was not mainstream. And I think it's the global influenza epidemic. I mean, a pandemic that is known as the Spanish flu is like when the term pandemic becomes a thing. And perhaps, today, I mean, this may actually be, I mean, COVID-19 might be the first time most people have heard or like started using the term pandemic in our age. I mean, if we want to think about lay people, not specialists. And just to add to that, I mean, of course, epidemic, pandemic, endemic, those are terms that now entered our vocabulary. So temporal dimension as opposed to spatial dimension are very important in thinking about these terms. But the thing is, even if you ask an epidemiologist today, these definitions are not clear cut. They're mostly intuitive. And, even though there are certain kind of parameters to define or to distinguish an epidemic from an endemic or pandemic disease, there's still, I mean, I think we're still operating with 19th century definitions. And so there is no clear differentiation. I mean, when I teach about this to my students, I say epidemic is usually an outbreak of disease that affects certain place that can be defined. Like if there's a disease outbreak on this campus, it's an epidemic, or in the city, or maybe even the state. But if it is, multiple countries or multiple continents, then it's a pandemic, right? I mean, it's not a very clear-cut definition, if you ask me. In fact, we saw that people, even public health specialists and sometimes, other medical professionals were using, or journalists were using the term endemic, and politicians, of course, the term endemic in a wrong way. Just, trying to communicate this image, this sense that if it's endemic, it doesn't matter anymore if it's not dangerous, which is, a very misguided way of thinking about it. And we are definitely not in the endemic stage, right? So that's like, couldn't be further away from the reality. And yet, you saw how those terms were manipulated into just suggesting or making people believe that this was less dangerous than it actually is. So I just added the term endemic to the question myself, but I think both time and place are important. And I still think that we are thinking in the 19th century definitions of these terms, right? At the same time, just to complicate things a little further, is because epidemiology as a field, when you look at historical epidemiology, it sounds very familiar to us historians. It's historical, right? That's fine. Modern epidemiology, developing, throughout the course of the 20th century, is a scientific discipline. Epidemiology wanted to differentiate itself as much as possible from its earlier historical roots to make it more scientific and legible to medical scientists. And kind of, really, it's not, even though it's, you could think that historical epidemiology started as something closer to humanities and social sciences. Modern epidemiology is like entirely borrowing methods of, just made more quantifiable research and graphs and charts and numbers and so entirely, in like natural science methodology. And so you don't see the articulation of the development of these terms. That's not something that, epidemiologists, like, it's all about numbers and metrics and formulae. So yeah, we're still kind of in the dark when it comes to like, how do we define these basic terms, right? Yeah. More questions, maybe more? Other plague myths? Right. I mean, I think what I would underline in those, like, repeated misinformation, and we've had enough of that in this pandemic, even though it's nothing new. It's always about other people, isn't it? Like, it's someone else's fault. It's never your own fault. I mean, I think, what I was just telling about earlier about like how these historians of, and medical doctors wrote about the history of plague, also the undertone, it's not our problem. We just suffer from it because it's other people's fault. I mean, I think that's a very prominent theme when you just, read it carefully, read it closely. It always belongs to other people. It's not ours. It just comes from outside. We're kind of the victim of it, like, or we're hosting the disease. Even the biological terms that we use today, disease host, right? It's not my fault. Just I'm hosting the disease. I mean, it's not surprising that these scientific terms in, like, you see the development of in biology, in zoology, in botanics, in like the whole system of, classifying the natural world, starting in like in the 18th century, creating the names of species and trying to impose a hierarchy of the species of, like, naming the natural world. And I think, it's no wonder that we bring our own social and political value judgments into that. On that note, perhaps. Thank you. Okay, I think this was Punar's.